So, chapter 4 brings us to Africa. And with regard to the earliest history of Africa, this presents us with a few challenges, though it also, also kind of forces us to think more carefully about, some of our definitions until now about what constitutes civilization, for instance. So, I mean, for instance, in many cases, we find what appear to be very complex societies, but they didn't necessarily have writing or weren't urban-based. Maybe didn't have, really well-developed bureaucracies. So, should we consider these as somehow not being civilized or uncivilized? In Africa, that is not to say that there weren't important states with writing cities and technology. We do find those as well. But at the same time, we find many states that were not organized in this way in terms of bureaucracies and not having writing. We can't speak of large urban literate populations. But we should be careful not to just to assume that the lack of these things means they lacked complexity, right? There could be different ways that societies evolve in terms of becoming more complex. Now, one of the problems with Africa is has to do with even where we feel there may have been writing, there's other problems as well. I mean, first of all, if you don't have written records or very few, obviously that's you're lacking a very important source of information about past societies. You do have oral traditions, and these can actually provide tremendously valuable information. But the further back you go, assuming that certain traditions were handed down from one generation to the next, they probably became distorted. So the trick then becomes, how do you discern what is reliable information from what might be embellishment? Obviously mythical elements probably don't correspond to actual individuals or events, or they might. They might reflect, that there was someone that existed, but over time they were kind of reconceptualized as a kind of more godlike figure or something in that vein. Archaeology, of course, is always valuable, but sometimes if we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, it's not always the best climate or environment for preservation. First of all, people generally use whatever material is handy. So in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, that would often be wood. And so that just simply doesn't preserve well almost under any circumstance. But definitely if you're talking more about a jungle environment, right, where kind of the nature of the ecosystem is basically to constantly be recycling material, things very rapidly decay and disappear. Finally, we do have sources from people visiting the region from outside, very often written sources. Some of the earliest are Islamic historians who were traveling in sub-Saharan Africa. Later on, Europeans, particularly connected with European colonialism. Of course, in either of these cases, we're getting the perspective of the outsider. And so very often there's a problem of bias. That doesn't mean all the information they're providing should be discounted, but we have to be aware of the bias. And there often was an assumption by these visitors that whatever they were seeing is kind of how it had been forever, right? A kind of timelessness of African societies. And this is definitely a major assumption. Now, we might start off by considering Africa in terms of its different environments and the climate. Africa is huge, right? The African continent is about 3.5 times the size of the continental United States. Something often not evident if you're looking at a flat map of the world, which tends to distort and enlarge territories to the north. Now, in terms of the development of civilizations that are urban-based, there definitely are some obstacles that Africa presents, certain challenges. We find very few natural harbors, not much by way of islands off the coast. It does have a lot of rivers, but many of these are not easy to navigate apart from the Nile. Now, if we think about Africa in terms of environment, we might start with the topography. In the center, you generally have rainforest or kind of more jungle type environment, and then moving north and south in both directions, it opens into savanna. And savanna is kind of more sparsely wooded kind of terrain, and then eventually into what we call Sahel, which is kind of very arid semi-desert type environment, and then finally, again, both heading north and south, we run into desert. By the way, the term Sahel actually comes from Arabic meaning coast, in this case kind of the coastline of the desert. And in the north, of course, we have the Saharan desert, which is a rather formidable obstacle definitely a kind of barrier to some extent, between developments in the Mediterranean world and Middle East on the one hand, and sub-Saharan Africa on the other, which is not to say that there wasn't interaction between both and influence running in both directions. Of course, the desert to the north, the Sahara Desert, might interest students to know that Sahara is actually from the word for desert in Arabic, Sahara. If there's any desert that deserves to simply be called the desert, it might be the Saharan Desert. Now, in terms of resources, right, that also would have an impact in terms of how societies developed. Agriculture is very often going to be difficult. Soil is generally not well suited to agriculture, certainly not in a jungle environment where the constant rains leach off minerals and nutrients. So the soil is not, if you try to actually chop down trees and grow on it, probably after 1 or 2 seasons, most of the soil would have washed away. As you go further, further away from the jungle areas, but not all the way to the desert, you have the possibility of farming, but then again, sometimes water is scarce. You have problems with pests and insects. This can also be a problem for pastoralism, the raising of animals. On the plus side, abundant animal life for hunting and fishing. One might imagine that however complex a society becomes, it might develop around those kind of activities. And there is great mineral wealth in Africa in terms of salt, iron, copper, and gold. It's kind of worth noting that humankind as a whole had its origins in Africa. Our earliest hominid ancestors actually evolved in East Africa in what's known as the Great Rift Valley about 1.5 to 1.8 million years ago. So here you see kind of an artist's depiction of Australopithecus. And I think at the very beginning of the course we talked a bit about kind of early hominids and the evolution of humankind. We should note, though, it's probably also the case that modern humans first appeared in Africa, probably about 100,000 BCE, and then kind of radiated out to the rest of the world from there. So in a very real sense, we could all say that our original ancestors, all of us, came from Africa. Now, as I noted, there's a reason why we have a chapter devoted to sub-Saharan Africa, because in some ways developments taking place there are unique and distinct from what's happening in the Mediterranean world, inclusive of North Africa. Having said that, again, we have evidence of interaction not just between sub-Saharan Africa and what we might call Nilotic Africa, kind of referring to the Nile River. And that, kind of was definitely one of the major bridges between the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa. We also have evidence of trade taking place between sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of Asia and the Middle East via the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Sea. Now, one way to kind of organize our discussion of different, kind of the development of different societies and civilizations in Africa is by kind of breaking it down into 4 major language families. And this is not the first time we've done this. We talked about kind of Indo-European languages, which tell us a lot about the various peoples that speak them, that they had a common point of origin. Literally, people who study linguistics are able to determine at what point in time different peoples diverged based on how similar their respective languages are to one another. So in the case of Africa, we talk about 4 major indigenous language families. First of all, we have Afro-Asiatic languages, and that's kind of reflected here on the map in yellow. That would include, by the way, Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic. We have Niger-Congo languages, inclusive of Bantu, which is the most spoken language in Africa. That would be represented here by the blue. Then we have Nilo-Saharan languages, represented by the green, and the smallest language family would be Khoisan languages, represented here in orange. And so, we have some sense of the movement of people by, kind of tracing linguistic connections. So pretty much what we think we know from about 8,000 BCE, people speaking Afro-Asiatic languages, kind of coming from the Jordan and Nile valleys, spread to Arabia and then across North Africa, and then started to move southward from North Africa around 4,000 BCE. Nilo-Saharan languages probably originated in the Nubian region of the Nile, so kind of in the upper Nile, upriver, so to speak, and from there spread westward around 5000 BCE, and then later were kind of like pushed out by people speaking Afro-Asiatic languages, right? So that's kind of why you might remember on the map, you kind of see the green areas look like pockets that have been kind of surrounded by the yellow area representing Afro-Asiatic languages. Niger-Congo originated in Central and West Africa and then radiated, well, mostly southwards, but also in other directions. And that becomes the dominant language in sub-Saharan Africa. And then finally, the Khoisan languages, which originated in the south, those definitely seem to be have been squeezed into small pockets by the spread of Bantu. So currently, they're the most widely dispersed language family, right? Like various pockets here and there disconnected from one another as Bantu just kind of like surrounded them. Now, one last thing we should talk about in connection with Africa, because very often, you know, in kind of the common parlance, we talk about race as somehow a way of organizing people. So first of all, let's just begin by noting there is no genetic biological basis for race. In fact, there is more genetic variation between individuals and between groups of people. Racial categories are largely constructed, and one might argue making a great deal out of skin color, a great deal more than one should be able to surmise in this basis. I mean, this would be kind of like you might as well organize people on the basis of hair color. You know, so I mean, yes, it tells you something about skin color, but that's about it. Might interest people to know that there are some groups in Africa that are more closely related genetically to Europeans than to other African groups, which probably means, you know, it's just an indication that that was the group from whence came the people who eventually migrated to Europe. Of course, you know, having said that, there has been historically for a long time a kind of association of sub-Saharan Africa with dark-skinned people, and some of the terms we have reflect that. The term Ethiopian is literally Greek for those with burnt skins, today referring to a very specific part of Africa. The Arabs used to refer to sub-Saharan Africa as Bilad el-Sudan, literally Sudan meaning blacks, the land of the blacks. Today, of course, we tend to think of that referring specifically to one country just south of Egypt. Speaking of the Sahara, it might surprise some people to know that that desert wasn't always there. You can see from this kind of aerial view of it, it's quite large, right? And it is, in fact, continuing to grow. But originally, there wasn't desert there. You had more kind of, I mean, it wasn't exactly forests, but you had lakes and rivers and trees and kind of high grass and a reasonable climate, actually quite suitable for agriculture. So this is going back around 2500 BCE. By 1000 BCE, the climate had begun to change, and that's when it started becoming uninhabitable desert. Though routes would continue to connect the Mediterranean with sub-Saharan Africa. We have evidence, however, that before that happened, if you go back to around mid-5th millennium BCE, say around 1500, we have evidence of an agricultural civilization consisting of upwards of 200 towns. Of course, as the region became more arid, people had to migrate. Many of them headed southward into sub-Saharan Africa, and they did bring with them agriculture and pastoralism. Again, pastoralism referring to the raising of animals or herds of sheep or cattle. If more desert environment, it might be camels. So we start to see the emergence of new cultures in sub-Saharan Africa following that. And you know, early on, we have limited evidence regarding what we're able to know about them. One culture that's quite interesting, and this kind of also corresponds to a kind of development in technology with the beginning of the Iron Age. So we start to see iron smelting furnaces in roughly what corresponds to northeastern present-day Nigeria on the Jos Plateau. We see a new culture emerging that we refer to as Nok Culture. We don't know what they call themselves. This is a term that was invented. But we have evidence that they had actually engaged in agriculture and cattle herding, clearing woodlands for agriculture. Probably the most interesting artifact they've left behind are these very distinguished terracotta sculptures, some of which are death masks. We see an example of one of them here. This is not a death mask, but of the sculpture. We also have, kind of evidence of their of developments related to iron technology. But in some ways, the sculptures are the most interesting thing. And I don't know how many of you have actually seen more contemporary African art, of which sculpture is a very common form, including masks. But if you have, you probably would almost instantly recognize this as an example, as something coming of African origin, and it's quite possible that this is, kind of a form, artistic form that was developing with the Nok culture that would continue to influence later West African sculptural traditions. At a higher level, at least in terms of what we often think of as civilization, if we move over to the east, just below Egypt, we have the Kingdom of Kush. So this is, after the Egyptians, the second literate and politically unified civilization to emerge in Africa. And their earliest capital was at a place called Kerma, which isn't too far from the present-day Egyptian border. This actually was a major trading outpost for Egypt during the period of the Middle Kingdom. And it definitely flourished around 17 to 1500 BCE, in large part not just through trade, but they actually produced a great deal of gold. You have the Nubian gold mines. And around 1000 BCE, before that, they were subjected to Egyptian colonial rule during the New Kingdom, but they became independent again around 1000 BCE, so jumping a little ahead there. You're going to see that the Kingdom of Kush is going to go through a number of phases, but always with very strong connections to Egypt, and definitely influenced by Egyptian civilization, but also influencing it in return. After the Kushite Empire became independent again, they relocated their capital further up the Nile to a place called Napata. And there they flourished through the 7th century BCE, even at some point conquering Egypt and dominating it roughly during the 8th century BCE. So that was just prior to the end, so to speak. They were, in fact, eventually driven out of Egypt by the Assyrians, after which they became somewhat isolated. And then later on, they were subjected to the Egyptian army, who sacked the capital in 591 BCE. But after that, they continued. They just relocated the capital further upriver. And this is kind of the pattern you see emerging here, right? That they just kind of keep relocating their capital further away from the Egyptian border. Partly, you never want to have your capital on the frontier with another kingdom that you might find yourself in conflict with. The new capital was Meroe. But before we go to that, just as an example of Egyptian influence during the Napatan period, we see, for instance, the construction of pyramids that were used to bury the Napatan rulers who took the title pharaoh. So we see very strong evidence of Egyptian influence there. But based on this particular image, you can see some three figures, three human beings in the corner that are approaching the pyramids. So you can see that they're considerably smaller than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and also that the shape is somewhat different, right? They're kind of much more vertical. And in fact, you really couldn't have this shape if you were going to build on a much larger scale. The pyramids would probably collapse under their own weight. But nonetheless, you can see the Egyptian influence here. Looking at the Meroitic Empire, so this is kind of the third phase of the Kushite empires. And so the Meroitic Empire, taking its name from the capital of Meroe, which was both a political and cultural center. And their kind of foundation economically was more related to the production of iron goods. And it might be that the knowledge of smelting iron, at least to some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, originated there. And they definitely were very active in trade, both with other parts of Africa, but also points abroad, so part of kind of international commercial relations. The city of Meroe no longer exists, so here we see the archaeological site corresponding to the city. And probably, this is probably the period when the Kushites were most active in trade. Meroe was definitely a very important center of trade. So this corresponds to the Hellenistic and then later the Roman period with respect to the Mediterranean. And so they were trading with the Mediterranean, but also southern Arabia, India, and other points in sub-Saharan Africa. And so mostly they were kind of a point of transit for goods, but they did also produce one item for export. Their pottery was actually highly desirable abroad. We see an example or two examples here. Very interesting, there are some aspects of their political system that are quite interesting. So we do see Egyptian influence, but there are some really important differences. So first of all, unlike in Egypt, kings ruled by customary laws interpreted by clerics. So therefore, kings were not exactly godlike beings who would just simply ordain whatever they wished. And in fact, there were certain restrictions or taboos on their behavior, which if they violated, if they went against, could see them sentenced to death by their own hand, forced to commit suicide. Another interesting distinction is that the royal succession was through the maternal line. Kings were selected via an election system, right? So, I mean, not involving everyone, but the more important members of the kingdom. And the queen mother would have played a very important role. And in fact, sometimes monarchs were women. And would actually take the title of queen, so it was kind of acknowledging that they were women. They even had a special title for such rulers. They were the Candaces. And finally, we should note that they actually had a pretty well-developed bureaucracy, and power wasn't as centralized in the hands of the king as you might find in, say, ancient Egypt. For instance, you had princes appointed as provincial governors who often had tremendous leeway in how they governed. They had considerable autonomy. Finally, regarding Meroitic society, well, the vast majority of individuals, apart from the governing elite, were cattle breeders, farmers, and traders. Again, we have slavery. And that just is a kind of reappearing institution historically. Their religion was very similar to that of the Egyptians, and they even borrowed many of their gods and goddesses from them. Ammon was particularly important, with many temples dedicated to him. They did also have a few unique gods. Probably the most famous was Apedemak, but here we see kind of a very Egyptian-like depiction of him with a human body and a head, the head of a lion. So he was a warrior god. And we also, this is kind of the first half of our lecture on sub-Saharan Africa. We're going to finish with developments in what today corresponds to Ethiopia, where we see the emergence in 330 CE, the Common Era, of the Christianized state of Aksum, or the Aksumite Empire. So the people residing there actually reflect kind of a number of different influences linguistically and culturally that are kind of all mixing together. Definitely the Kushite Empire to the north had some influence, and we find also Semitic speakers from South Arabia, many of whom at some point has settled on the Ethiopian plateau by around 500 BCE. And most important was the port of Adulis, which became a major point of trade, also a major market for ivory and elephants. Right? So these are two goods that would have come from the interior of Africa, but then might have been sold and then traded abroad. Now, I mentioned that they were a Christianized state. This is probably one of the most interesting things about the Aksumite Empire, and in fact reflects the origins of the present-day Ethiopian or Abyssinian church, which constitutes the majority religion in Ethiopia. So it's a very distinct Christian sect with their own particular beliefs, some of which are different from mainstream Christian belief, as you might find in the Catholic or Orthodox churches. Also certain practices that are unique. So prior to this, they had pretty much been pagan, and a clear indication of how much influence was coming from Arabia is the fact that their religion probably corresponded mostly to what was practiced there. But then in the 4th century, their ruler, King Ezana, converted to Christianity, and as went the king, so went his subjects, and eventually the whole kingdom became Christianized, resulting in the Ethiopian or Abyssinian church. Now, I mentioned that they have some beliefs that are unique, that differ from mainstream Christianity. Probably most notable in this regard is that they are monophysite. This refers to the nature of Jesus. In most churches, it is held, and this is kind of part of the creed, kind of the official belief, that Jesus is equally God, equally human. In the Ethiopian church, they believe that he is fully divine. So they really don't make much of or even discount this kind of human aspect of Jesus. They also have some of their own practices. They even have their own liturgical language. So they use their own Semitic language of Ge'ez in the liturgy, though initially they probably used Greek, and that probably reflected from whence they borrowed or from whence they took their Christian belief. They definitely were an important trading center linking the Roman world with many other parts of the world, Africa to be sure, but also many points in Asia. So Aksum was an important point on the Indian Ocean trade routes, and so kind of a point connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. We already talked about ivory and elephant, but there were other items that were exported that came from the interior, such as obsidian, slaves, gold dust, and various other kinds of inland products. And so you can see here kind of the developing networks of trade. The red would reflect the Silk Road, which I think I mentioned, but if not, just to note that it actually constitutes a network of roads and even some sea routes. So it's not just a single road. But the blue would correspond to kind of more sea routes, some of which are connected with the Silk Road, some of which are distinct. But you can see together they're connecting many points all the way from China to Europe through India, including Africa, Arabia, and Southeast Asia. As far as the Aksumite kingdom, we might note that at some points they actually controlled a good part of Arabia, as you can see from this map. This is kind of the kingdom of Aksum at its greatest extent. And this kind of reflects the fact that currently the country of Yemen, which roughly corresponds to the Arabian territory there, is in some ways, has certain elements that are distinct from the rest of Arabia, and that probably reflects to some degree influences coming from Ethiopia, though also from the fact that it was really tied into these trade routes across the Indian Ocean. So we'll pause there and continue our discussion of Africa in a separate series of PowerPoints.